2 weeks ago, something interesting finally happened in this deadbeat town. I live near the ocean, but not in some scenic beach town. I live in a run-down mess of a place. No fancy seafood restaurants or anything. Heck, we just got a McDonald's for the first time 2 years ago. There was a bad tropical storm though, the worst I've seen since my childhood. But this isn't anything out of the ordinary for us. We see at least a couple of those every year. The strange thing about this storm was what it washed up. It washed a pipeline onto the shore of our local beach. Nobody thought much of it at first, it just laid there amongst a bunch of other debris. The fourth night it was there though, a couple of kids supposedly told their parents they were going to go check it out, and they assumed they crawled into it. These kids went missing. The authorities searched the pipeline, but they said once they hit water in it, the kids were still nowhere to be found. In a small town like ours, a disappearance like this was big news. Most of us figured that the kids drowned in the ocean on the way home or had gotten kidnapped. Something sad but logical. My friends and I, however, thought we'd check it out for ourselves. My friends Calvin, Harrison, and I decided we'd stroll down to the beach after dark and climb down the pipeline. We all worked dead-end 9-to-5 jobs, and this would have been the most exciting thing we'd done in ages. It was about a 10-minute walk to the beach for me. The air was cool and the sky was clear. The moon was rather large in the night and carried an ominous orange glow. I followed this orange glow of the moon all the way to the beach, where I met Calvin. Harrison arrived shortly after with a bag of flashlights and some rope to pull ourselves out if it got bad in there. When we got to the pipeline, Harrison was the most eager to enter of all of us. "Come on, slowpokes!" he yelled at us. Calvin was enthusiastic earlier, but looked uneasy about going in now that it was actually time. He had a worried look on his face, and he stared at me, hoping I'd back out with him. I didn't, though. I followed Harrison into the pipeline, and Calvin reluctantly followed after. We crawled on our hands and knees through the pipeline for about 10 minutes, and Harrison turned his head to me and said, "What the heck?" He shined the light ahead of him, illuminating the tunnel for about 50 feet ahead, where there was a sharp drop-off. Harrison began to pull the rope out of his bag and tied it to a small rod sticking out of the wall in the pipeline. "Wait," said Calvin. "If that goes straight down, then how the hell did it wash up here? That goes straight into the floor of the sea. There's no way I'm..." He was cut off by Harrison. "Listen here, you wimp. We're going down there. What if we find those boys? We'll be heroes!" I cut in though. "Harrison, how do we even know they're alive?" He got quiet at this. We'll find them one way or the other." Harrison finished tying off his rope and then began to pull the rope along with him to the edge of the drop-off. When he got there, he threw the rope over the edge of the drop-off and stuck his head over the edge for a minute, listening for anything down below. The only sound you could hear, though, was a quiet but steady drip coming from below. "We'll go down there one at a time until we know what's down there or how deep it goes," he said. Harrison proceeded to grab the rope and lower himself over the ledge. He didn't say anything. All we heard was the patter of his feet down the side of the pipeline. We waited on him in complete darkness, lit only by the faintest amount of moonlight coming in at the opening of the pipeline for what seemed like ages. After what had to have been at least 15 minutes, we heard a very light patter against the ground in the distance, and a yell.
"Guys, I'm at the bottom!"
Calvin and I sprung up in confusion. "What's down there?" I yelled to him.
"I don't know what this is. It's like a cave."
"I don't like this," said Calvin. "Are the kids down there?" I asked Harrison.
"No, I don't see anybody else down here, but it looks like there's a tunnel that leads further in."
Calvin quietly pulled on my shirt, obviously wanting me to stay behind with him and tell Harrison that this was insane and we should leave. Honestly, I also had reservations about climbing 50 feet further down under the Atlantic Ocean, but I put my reservations to the side and began climbing down with Harrison. Upon getting to the bottom of the hole, I was uneasy. It was strangely very warm. You could hear the shifting of the ocean in the distance, though. Through what was obviously a solid layer of rock. Calvin followed down shortly after I did. I almost thought he was going to run off and leave us behind. I almost wish he had. The poor guy had a look of death on his face. Inspecting the cave around us, we found it rather strange. The roof of the cave met perfectly and almost seemed to blend with the pipeline we entered. We briefly looked at each other and decided to continue on into the cave ahead of us. Harrison led us. We walked into the mouth of the cave, unsure of what to expect. There was just the slightest breeze coming towards us. As we walked through, we scanned the walls with our flashlights. The walls went from being rocky to dry and moist, almost organic looking as we went further in. The gray, chalky consistency faded away, giving way to a blue, glowing, and almost mucus-like texture. The wind lost its consistent push against our faces too, and it began blowing against us periodically instead. It even began coming from behind us sometimes. Just a steady in, followed by a blowing out. Calvin kept whining that he saw the walls moving or closing in on us, but we didn't give him much attention and blamed it on him being paranoid. After we walked what I guess was about a mile, we found ourselves in another smaller room. In it, you could clearly hear the sound of the ocean flowing outside. "We must be closer to the walls of the cavern now. That's the ocean outside," I said. "That's not the ocean," said Calvin. "Don't you hear that? Those sounds are perfectly in sync with those gusts of wind. There's something further in here causing that breeze." After his comment, Harrison and I realized he was right. We hadn't even noticed it, but every noise we heard was followed shortly thereafter by a light, warm gust of wind. After a few minutes of searching, we found an opening on the ground below us. I got on my hands and knees and lowered myself into the hole, and was amazed to find that the ground below me was soft but solid, and also rather slimy. Lowering myself down, I realized that the cold rock gave way to some warm, slimy, but slightly rimmed walls. The hole was circular and just small enough that I could prop my back up against the rear while holding my feet against the wall in front of me. Shining my flashlight, I could see that the ground was about 15 feet below me. I climbed and dropped myself down. I went first this time, wiggling myself down into the cavern. Harrison and Calvin followed. This room was much different than the others. The dark blue tint gave way to a pinkish-red colored wall. Calvin's fears were met, as the walls in the room were without a doubt steadily sinking in and out, towards and away from us. At our feet, we felt the soft ground rumbling, and then began to feel more and more moist. "What is this place?" said Harrison. "It's alive, guys!" Calvin yelled, scrambling towards the wall we came in through. Obviously freaked out, Calvin started jumping up towards the rimmed wall, and just grabbed a hold of it, but before he could pull himself up, a thick film of mucus began to throw itself down from the cave we came into and across the mouth of the opening, pushing Calvin out and hiding the opening among the rest of the wall. Calvin then ran against the wall with his back to it, cowering and shining his flashlight all around the room. "Look out!" yelled Harrison. He then pushed me to the ground. Where I was previously standing, a wave of foul-smelling liquid began to pour onto the ground. Harrison and I ran over to Calvin, looking for an exit, scanning the room with our lights. The room was quickly filling with fluid that burned when it touched our skin. We're in its stomach, aren't we?" Calvin mumbled to himself. Then my light hit a pale white patch on the other side of the room. "There!" I yelled. "I can see through that! If we break through that, we might be able to make it out." We ran across the room, our legs burning while they waded through the thick stomach acid-like fluid. I began to bash at the patch with my flashlight, but Harrison pushed me out of the way, grabbing a knife out of his bag and plunging it into the light patch, ripping it open in front of us. Ahead of us was a tight corridor. It would just barely fit us, but we would take anything over the room we were in. We lunged into it, knowing that it was the only chance we had. We scrambled to get away from the fluid that was slowly following us through the small tunnel as we went further and further in. It smelled more and more disgusting as we went further, and it got tighter and tighter, eventually getting to the point where we were all in a very small space and we could barely move on. It smelled so bad I could barely breathe. Between the smell and the tightness of the space, I was sure I was going to die there. This certainty was only increased when the walls began to close in around us, squeezing us even tighter. Harrison gasped for breath and yelled, "I'm so sorry I brought you guys here." I couldn't respond though. All I could do was reach for his hand in the chaos and squeeze it tight with reassurance. But then I felt something. A rush of movement as liquid hit my back, and my face was dragged against the soft but hard-pressed walls of the tunnel. Calvin, Harrison, and I were pushed out of the tunnel and into a rush of cool water. My immediate reaction was to gasp for air, but I realized where I was just in time. We were underwater. Above me, I could see the sun hovering over the water, and I made a break, swimming for the surface. My ears rang with pain as I rushed towards the sunlight above me, and I burst out, gasping for breath, shortly followed by Calvin and Harrison. After we gained composure, we looked around us to see that we were about 100 feet from the beach where we started. Panicked and ready to get away from whatever we were inside of, we made a dash for the shore. When we got there, we looked up and around us, but the pipeline was gone. In its place were only our footsteps and its deep impression in the sand. It's been a few days now. We're not exactly sure what to think. All we do know is that whatever almost got those kids, almost got us too.